So I am pleased to present my colleagues from the BioSci program today, Dr. Terry McElhenney, Dr. John Stoltzfus, and Dr. Kristen Parent. They have been co-teaching together for a while and in different ways, the three of them, and I'm sure they'll tell you more about that. But I think we asked them to present because they are exemplars of how to do this, of how you can really benefit from working together in a great model that engages tenure stream and fixed term faculty. And as you'll see, they also work with TAs and LAs, and we think it's just a really great model. So I just want to comment that these folks have all been engaged in undergraduate teaching for some time. Kristen has not been with us for that long, but immediately got involved in the BioSci program. Kristen and John were both fellows in our first cohort of the STEM Gateway Fellowship program, and Terry is a current fellow in our second cohort. So they come with some credentials, and I think we have a lot to learn from them today. So I'll hand it over to you folks.
Thanks, Cory. So we thought we'd start out with a definition of team teaching, and this one's from the literature: having two or more educators delivering meaningful instruction to diverse groups. And this definition stems from K-12 education. This is really where team teaching began, was people specifically in special education classrooms working together so that they could reach more students at once. And depending on the purpose of team teaching, whether it's a cost-saving measure, whether it's a training exercise for one of the faculty, or whether, as our dean likes to say, it's sort of a cross-teaching between someone who is more versed in pedagogy and someone who is in the research lab. It really depends on that, how your team teaching experience will look, but regardless of the purpose of team teaching, there's sort of a circular pattern that is involved in all the different types of team teaching that we'll talk about today. That is, the individuals work together to plan the course and implement it. Then once the course is finished, there is reflection on how things went, and then you use your observations and reflection from the students to further improve the course over successive semesters. So I think what we'd like to do now is introduce ourselves. We're going to start with Dr. John Stoltzfus. He'll tell us a little bit about his experience.
All right, so I started formally as an instructor at MSU in 2003, and my role has been primarily as in a teaching capacity. So I have taught a lot of classes in a lot of different circumstances. So I started out teaching. The first few classes I was teaching were upper level biochemistry courses with enrollments over 500. In some cases I was the sole instructor, in some cases I was sort of doing rotational teaching, which we'll define later, where three instructors would each take a little part of the course and do our thing in that part of the course. Since then my teaching has evolved quite a bit, and currently I'm teaching with Kristen, is sharing a section where we actually, instead of rotating, we are involved with each other in pretty much every lecture. There's a lead instructor, but we both are there, we both know what's going on, and we work back and forth in the classroom pretty much every day. I've also sort of team taught with Terry in sort of two different circumstances. In one case, we both had different sections of the same class, and we worked back and forth together. And in another case, we actually team taught together in the same section of the course. And the courses we're teaching now are smaller. There's only 250 students in those sections, and we have more support. So when I first started teaching, oftentimes I was a sole instructor with 300 students and no graduate TA or one quarter-time graduate TA. And we now have a lot more support in terms of graduate TAs and undergraduate learning assistants, which, as we'll talk about later, kind of influences, they're part of the team, really. So, so Kristen, you want to tell us a little bit about what you...
So I've been here at MSU for almost 4 years now, and I've never actually taught a course on myself, as a sole instructor. I've done the rotational type that John just described in a couple of classes where there might have been 12 or 13 different instructors, and then the team teaching where we're in a pair in a really collaborative way in 161. before I came here, I was a TA in several very small lab classes that were maybe 10 to 30 students. So it was a very different experience for me to jump into a class of 300 students and have this sort of collaborative role. But I think it's been really awesome. So I definitely come from a very different perspective that I've never actually taught on my own. So I'm going to give only a one-sided view of this.
So I'm in the Department of Integrative Biology. I teach both online and in the classroom. My class sizes have ranged from 20 to over 300. And I've team taught in several different ways. I've team taught both with John, as he mentioned before, in BioSci 161 and also in iBio 341, which is fundamental genetics. And then probably my favorite team teaching experience was a study abroad course that I did in Kenya, where there were 3 of us instructors. And we can talk a little bit about that later too, if you want to.
What?
Welcome, everyone.
Yeah. So I think that while it took quite a bit of time, hopefully it was worthwhile in that, I know it was worthwhile for me because I have some things I'm going to want to think about a little differently as we present. But hopefully for you as well to see that there's a wide variety of teaching situations, and there's often constraints on those teaching situations that make some of the things we say maybe not as relevant, or you'll have to think about them in different ways because we really don't teach in a vacuum. There are constraints on what happens in our classrooms. So to start out, do you want to hand out the handout? Sure. So to help us think about these sort of different teaching scenarios, what we want everybody to do is take a couple minutes. We're going to give you a handout. It has a number of boxes in it, and just imagine that you were given a teaching assignment. You're going to be the sole instructor for this course. This course is called Lollipops 101, and so you have to figure out, as an instructor, the sole instructor for this course, how would you set up the course? So go ahead. There's a little description of the course there. You're given, kind of constraints. You're the sole instructor. It's 250 students. Here's the kind of general things you have to cover. How would you set up this course as the sole instructor? So go ahead and work through, fill in the boxes.
Does anyone still need one?
Do you have any pens?
Maybe.
So what we're going to do, if you haven't finished, that's okay. We're going to run through and we're going to give our kind of definitions of some different types of teaching scenario or situations. When the food gets here, then you can complete this if you want to, if you're not quite done yet. And we will, and then we'll move on from there. So we're going to start off and talk about how we view different teaching situations. And as we saw from the introductions, there's lots of experience out here as well. So if you have anything to add to our kind of definitions or descriptions of these teaching situations, please jump in and give us your thoughts on those as well. So to start off, whoops, wrong one. Too many computers.
So many of us have taught as the sole instructor, where it's just you and upwards of 350 students. You're in control of everything that happens within the classroom. You, the first time, may get the syllabus from the person who taught it the time before, but you're basically starting from the ground up. And something that we'll be carrying forward into all of the team teaching descriptions is that when we are sole instructors, we use active learning in some way, typically with some sort of student response system, like clickers, where they are actively doing things within the classroom, even though we're just the only person who's running the day-to-day lectures.
And I guess one point there is, you can decide whether you want to do active learning or not. It's completely up to you how you run the course. I mean, at Michigan State, really the constraint is usually a 3-sentence course description, is as long as what you do has some alignment with that course description, you pretty much can do whatever you want. And that's been my experience. Anyone else have other experiences with that? Oh, yeah. So next slide. Okay. So with rotational teaching, you now have one other instructor at least, and in some cases it's 2 or 3 other instructors you're going to work with. And so we're defining rotational teaching as you have the course syllabus, you sit down at some point before the course starts and you say, okay, you're taking lectures 1 through 8, I get lectures 9 through 15, and you get 16 through the end of the course. We each get 1 exam. All right, we're good, let's go. And in some cases there is a coordinator who kind of tries to make sure that there is some agreement between what's happening with the different instructors, and oftentimes helps with the exams, making sure all the exams get run in kind of the same way. In some cases, there is wide disparity between what happens with instructor 1, instructor 2, instructor 3 in terms of approach to the course, in terms of presentation style, whether they're using active learning and how they're using active learning. And so in a way, it's not unlike being a sole instructor, only you just don't have to teach the whole thing, you get to teach your little section of the course. So that's how we're kind of defining rotational teaching. And of course, it doesn't have to be quite that strict, and sometimes people who are splitting the lectures up do a better job of coordinating and integrating, but sometimes not so much.
So on the flip side, collaborative teaching is a very open discussion between the instructors, an instructional team, making sure everyone agrees on things prior to the semester and giving some sort of support often during the semester. So there's a lot of initial time investment in making sure things are agreed upon well ahead of time. Topic, order, content, teaching styles, what happens in the classroom, how you're going to handle assessments, and there's also constant interaction as the semester progresses. It's not just, okay, go. It's very much a lot of chatting back and forth and reflecting as the semester progresses and constantly communicating with one another.
And typically both people are present at each lecture.
Yes.
So with rotational teaching, oftentimes the lead instructor shows up to do their lectures, and maybe at some time in the past they've seen what the other instructors did, or maybe they haven't, but they see the topics in the syllabus, they know what they're going to talk about, so it's all good. Whereas with what we're calling collaborative teaching, you actually are showing up every day to every class, even if you're not the lead instructor, and you're there to see what's going on, and oftentimes doing more than just sitting there and listening, especially as the class becomes more active. And so at the end, I think we'll go back a little bit and talk about, well, why not talk about it right now? So the fact is, if you're doing rotational teaching or team teaching of any kind, and it's a straight lecture format, at some point attending the other person's lecture actually becomes really painful. Okay? You know the information. Sitting there and listening to somebody else tell this information at a lower level than you know it is really not a constructive use of your time. It really is not, right? And so if the mode of content delivery is going to be straight lecture, there probably isn't all that much advantage of trying to do collaborative teaching, as long as you really did know kind of what the other people were going to be talking about, so you could try to tie it together. But if you start doing active learning in the classroom, where you have the students in groups actually talking to each other, struggling with material, coming up with questions that they don't understand and needing help with that, having that second person in the classroom actually is really valuable, because you're walking around talking to the students during these activities. And now instead of having one person trying to run around and talk to all the different groups, you have two people who can kind of share that load. And interact with the students. And in that case, it actually kind of becomes, in some cases, kind of fun to be there, because you get to see what the students are thinking. You actually get to teach students on a very personal one-on-one or one-on-two or three level on a regular basis. So the style of the mode of content delivery, whatever you want to call it, really has an influence on whether rotational teaching makes more sense or more collaborative approach to teaching makes more sense.
So along with that, sort of the next level
Yeah.
is students, well actually, so we've got several levels. This is also involving the graduate TAs and ULAs as part of that team, so that they're present in every class too, and also highly interacting with the students.
But involved in this is some pretty hefty training of the GTAs and the ULAs. So as they're working with the students in the classroom, students just want to know the answer typically if they're struggling with something. And so the TAs and the ULAs need to be trained not to just give that answer, but to ask questions of the students so that they're led to the correct answer. And they also need to be trained to say, I don't know, when they don't know.
And also in this diagram is this sort of triangle here is coordinating not only between one section of a course, but multi-sections. So in 161, for example, there's 5 sections in the fall. And the model that we taught last first time together, Terry had one section and John and I had another. And we had common TA meetings and common ULA meetings, and we all made sure that the same content, different examples, certainly there was freedom in the classes, but the same content we were coordinating was being taught at the same time in the same different sections to help make a cohesive cross-section content of the course.
So go ahead.
So when you have parallel sections like that with common meetings, do you have the same active learning activities in class?
In this case, the three of us, we worked actively on the same modeling activities and the same, maybe not the same clicker questions in class, but the big modeling activities that were the 80-minute class period, we developed the three of us so that it was the same.
And so kind of along those same lines, so if your instructional model, once again, is we're going to lecture and we're going to give exams, having instructional teams like this, what are they doing during class? They're sitting back at the back of the class on their laptops, doing the same thing some of the students are doing, right? There's nothing really for them to do in class, so maybe they're useful for grading exams or homework, that type of thing. But if you have a really active class, then all the team members have something to do during class. They're actually, when there's activities, they're helping the students. And so we might back up just a minute here. So Kristen alluded to these modeling activities. So one of the things we've started doing, since we have enough resources, is actually a number of times during the semester, we will spend an entire day where we do not lecture almost at all. And we have a set of instructions. We put the students in groups of 3, and those students then spend basically the entire time in their group trying to work through and develop a model for how some process or phenomenon in biology happens, trying to apply the things they've been learning in class for the last few times to explain why something is happening and how it's happening. And so in that case, so our next slide, so we're actually using our students as well as part of the instructional team. In those situations where they're working in groups, the students bring things to the table. They know things. Sometimes they can do a better job of explaining ideas than I can because I've thought about it way too long on too deep a level to be able to see where those students are not grabbing onto it. And a student who's just figured this out can sometimes do a better job of helping somebody who's struggling to figure something out than I can. And so in fact, we think that in the sort of the largest sense of team instruction or team teaching, that the student groups are actually part of the instructional team in a way. I mean, a different role than the ULAs and GTAs and instructors. But they are a part of that team. So
We're actually going to demonstrate that later in this group.
Yeah. All right. So, but for now, so
This is,
Claire, did I answer I addressed your question?
Yes.
Okay. Other thoughts, comments, questions about
We love
sort of
questions.
these definitions that we've given here? And clearly you can see there's a whole spectrum here. We've kind of took little chunks and categorized them, but you can imagine other scenarios as well. So, yeah.
So one of the things that I struggle with about this is that right now my department is in a faculty teaching shortage, right? And this seems to be pretty time and labor intensive and requires a lot of FTE. So we're struggling even to cover the basic classes in terms of single instructors getting the job done, let alone having models with bigger ones. So are there any kinds of ways that this can be made efficient from that standpoint, where we're kind of doing the numbers math and just trying to make sure there's more bodies in each classroom to give some kind of instruction?
Well, so if you imagine, I don't know whether your classes all have single sections or whether you have classes where there's multiple sections.
Some of both.
So if you imagine a scenario where there's a class with multiple sections, and if you had 100 students per section, and sole instructors, right? Where the sole instructor then each is responsible for each of those sections, and they have to do every lecture in every one of those sections. If you were to merge, and I hate to say it, make a bigger section, right? You now have 200 students in the section, but if you were to then really have those instructors team teach, where they both showed up, they both have to show up to the same number of lectures, but they're only lead instructor for half of the lectures because they've now split that. And I actually would argue that I believe that in that kind of situation, you can have a higher quality experience for the students in that 200 student classroom than you would have in the individual 100 student classroom. So I think that may be an opportunity. one place I see where it may actually be able to, in a way, actually save the instructors a little bit of time because they would only have to prepare half of the lectures or be the lead instructor for half of the time. But you're right, there are huge constraints. We actually are in a really sort of very fortunate situation now, and I haven't always taught in these situations, where we have these resources to be able to do this type of thing.
One thing to add, if you don't have resources for faculty, there are postdoc teaching opportunities. So one thing we did in our department was make postdocs be able to join this as part of their training, and they would do a lecture or two to gain experience, but would be in the class interacting with the students. That's a way to increase your team fiscally cheaply.
And in some cases, and I think there's probably a wide range of views on this, we are fortunate to have the resources to pay our ULAs, but I know of faculty who get ULAs to volunteer. Undergrads, in some cases, are very willing to do this type of thing, especially in a way for a letter of reference. If they're astute, they realize this is a way to do that. Like I said, people are going to have different views on that. But in fact, it may be possible to set up a situation in your department where advanced undergrads really want this kind of experience and can do it with very low resource investment. So that's another possible approach to this. Yeah.
Back when we were like the most primitive form of team teaching with the rotational, one of the things we didn't talk about is coming to an agreement on the course syllabus. Are we going to talk about like differing teaching philosophies and how one person doesn't dominate the other? That's coming later.
So hopefully we will get to that, and if we do not, if that doesn't, bring that up again as we start talking about, we'll go back and revisit all of these things, so bring that up again. Yeah, very good.
You mentioned that the 200-person class might be a richer experience for the students than the 2 100 sections.
Yes.
What specifically are you referring to there? What are you thinking
Okay.
would make it richer?
What would make it richer? So, so if you have two, and actually, do we want to put a tack in that and talk about that later?
so.
Yeah.
So when we come back, I said, like I said, we're going to come back and talk about all these scenarios again. So let's sort of tack that up on the wall, remember it, and when we start talking about this again later, let's discuss it at that point in time. We'll just. Okay,
They can just pick one.
So this front table here is going to do rotational. Okay, this next table, you're going to do this in sort of a 2-instructor collaborative model with no GTAs or ULAs. This table is going to do a sort of an approach where you're using GTLs and ULAs but not really any formal groups. This table here is going to do GTAs, ULAs, formal groups, so sort of the sort of richest, if you will, environment. And then this table here, we'll let you guys choose. Okay? And over there, you get choice. Okay, so you can decide which scenario you want to do. So the goal is to go through and rethink each of those boxes on the handout. Negotiate with your partner, and if you're teams of 2 or teams of 3, it's fine if you're 3, and come up with what you would do differently in these classes, and kind of have to negotiate perhaps some of the things between the way you set it up initially yourself. So while you're eating, why don't you go ahead and work on that?
You're also we're gonna report back
Yes.
on what you've come up with. So choose somebody in your group who's gonna do the telling and tell us some of the key things that you've decided to keep the same or to change.
Yeah, so you might want to record some of these conversations and then have somebody to report out.
I don't know many
Sure, why not?
So what we thought we would do now are kind of go through one by one the different types of classroom design. We're going to start first talking about what we came up with, team teaching versus sole instructor, some pros and cons, and then we want to hear feedback from the different type of groups. So some of the things that we thought about, some we've already mentioned, like when you're team teaching, you're responsible for fewer lectures, even though you may attend the others, you're only lead instructor for maybe a subset. So in my case, I teach one half of the course, and so I only have to really prepare half the lectures. One thing in our group that I think is really important is that the shared ideas can strengthen the course assignments. and design. We're constantly giving each other feedback, and so every product that comes out, I think, is better than it would than if I were just doing it on my own, because my peers have different experiences and different really good ideas. In our case, because I'm a primarily research-intensive person, I have a very narrow focus on how I see biology, and so having a better alignment with topics and instructional expertise really helps me. I keep telling John, God help my students the day I have to teach them photosynthesis, because it's not something I have any experience in. So especially when you're teaching a very broad topics course, having multiple instructors that come to the table with different backgrounds and different really high levels of expertise, I think helps a lot. The cons is that it does give up some autonomy, so I can't just say, well, I feel like I'm going to do this. Especially when we're coordinating across sections that have a common curriculum. I can't throw one out the window, and I can't necessarily add something in. There's definitely time to negotiate shared vision on that, so agreeing on what things are common, and especially when you have multiple instructors and multiple sections, it's even a bigger challenge. I think in biosciences, there's over 20 instructors that are all coming together to have this common vision, so that does take time. Students can sometimes wig out if they have multiple instructors, especially in the STEM classes. This is their first time if they're freshmen. They've ever seen this model and they just don't get why we're doing it. So as we go on through the day, we'll talk about some things we've done purposefully to alleviate the student anxiety over what's going on. Some cons is that students can really maybe love one instructor and be very polar towards another. Or when they're giving feedback at the end on your series, you don't know who they're talking about because they'll say the instructor did this, and it's like, which one? Sharing and keeping track of course files is difficult in the modern age with Google Docs and all kinds of online tools. That's a bit less of an issue, but again, there is time to make that kind of infrastructure and accessibility. It does take time to do all of these things. So does anyone have any questions about the pros and cons or anything that they'd like to add here?
So, Joan, you have a taste of the rotational teaching and the team teaching, and as far as the students complaining about the multiple instructors, how do they compare?
So my experience is that when you do rotational teaching, you invariably get large amounts of negative feedback from the students about this. A major anxiety of students, and on some level understandably so. For many students, the major goal in the course is not how well am I learning this material, it's how high is my grade going to be. Right? And when you have 3 different instructors giving 3 different exams during the semester, each exam is basically a whole new ballgame. They have no idea what to expect, right? That creates huge amount of anxiety for the students. So, so one of the things that we have done when we collaborated is sometimes we mix the lectures up more. So it's not a big block of me and a big block of the next instructor and then a big. So in every exam, there's some each instructor has done some of the material. That was what Terry and I did. Chris and I don't do that quite as much. And so then each exam is not a whole new ball game. They've seen pretty much what it's going to be like because every exam is a collaboration between the instructors. Chris and I also work together on every exam. The exam formats look very much the same, and the middle exam is kind of shared between the 2 instructors. So I think that helps alleviate some of that anxiety. And anecdotally, I've never done any rigorous look at this, but the number and the vehemence of student comments about having multiple instructors is much less when you're doing sort of a true collaboration than the rotational teaching.
Can I add to that too? So one thing that was really hard for me in the first semester is I came in halfway through and the students looked at me as like a glorified TA, that I was not the lead instructor because halfway through, who is this person who's in class? So one thing that we've done is we share the first lecture, and halfway through the first lecture, I'm giving them clicker questions and hitting it right off the mark that I am also an instructor and I will be assessing you. So I think that that helps too because they're used to seeing me up there asking them questions from day one. Where if you have a rotational setup, you might not have all the instructors at the first introductory lecture.
Yeah.
I was wondering a little bit, I've heard from my chair and then the co-teaching is with people in other departments too. This idea of, being really clear on, you know, what the, and who's doing which piece, right, for evaluation, either from a promotion, tenure, or just annual evaluations. And I was kind of wondering how you dealt with that when it's not this clear rotational piece.
So I just went through reappointment, so I can tell you my experience. There's still pieces of the course that I was the lead on, so like one with the particular modeling activities. We discussed this when I said, John, are you okay if I present this as I was the lead on this? And so I just presented it to my department as this was my part of my teaching portfolio. And in the case of the biochemistry department, in terms of teaching credit, the way that we do collaborative team teaching, since I'm in every class, I actually get more credit for doing that than I am if I were strictly doing rotational and I only showed up to my chunk. So I think that biochemistry is good at
That of course depends on your chair. So that is, if you can negotiate with your chair for these other lectures where you're not actually lead instructor, but you're there to count for something, maybe half of them, you know, if you were the lead instructor. So if you do a whole semester of collaborative teaching, you get 3/4 credit instead of half credit. I mean, that can help too, at least internally. And so our chair has been very open and very supportive of that. But that once again is a department by department thing. All right, so what we'd like to do now is have you reflect a little bit and give us some feedback. So you got to design Lollipops 101 as a sole instructor, and then you all had to, as teams, negotiate at least some type of co-instruction with at least one other person. So we want to try to get a feel for what kind of things changed when you did this. So first of all, let's think a little bit about assessment. So when you were the sole instructor with 250 students, what kind of assessments did you plan? So let's just shout it out.
Multiple choice exams?
Multiple choice exams. So how many people had something other than multiple choice exams?
I had one big team project.
So you put a team project in there. And so what did we do back here?
I did a bit of writing.
A little bit of writing.
I mean, it's hard to grade that many, but
Okay.
I think
I found that automation really dictated how I was looking at things, like I was sort of reverse engineering things from
Yeah.
how complicated it would become.
Exactly. When you're the sole instructor with 250 students, you are looking for efficiencies. You are looking for ways to automate, to use multiple choice. So when you started teaching as a team, how many people changed what they were doing in terms of assessment? So just raise your hand. Okay. And this is kind of not what I would expect. Not much change up here in the front, perhaps, but as you got back to being able to incorporate GTAs and ULAs, you had a richer suite of things available to you. You had more resources available to you. And so I think that's one of the things that as you start getting true instructional teams, it becomes open to you, is a more rich way, a more diverse way of assessing what the students are learning and what they're able to do. So how long did it take you on your own? Of course, now you've seen the syllabus already. How long did it take you on your own versus when you were trying to work this out with team teaching? Did it take, so how many people felt it took less time to do this on your own than when you were doing the negotiations? So how many people thought it took more time on your own than with negotiations? People not really responding.
equal time. That's the other.
So our experience would be that if you're doing this on your own, it probably takes you less time. Okay? You sit down, you make the decision, you say this is how it's going to be. Okay? If you're doing it with somebody else, you at least have to talk about it, even if you come up with completely the same thing. You have to spend time talking about it. And there's probably going to be things that you don't. So how many people disagreed at least on one thing when you started working with somebody else, right? Yeah, pretty much everybody had to at least talk through one thing. Okay? And that, while it takes more time, is also an opportunity. So how many people, when they started talking to somebody else about this class, kind of had the moment like, oh, that's kind of a cool way to do it. I hadn't thought of that, right? So that's one thing. As soon as you start working as a team, it's going to take longer, but we think you wind up with more quality product, a more quality experience for the students when you're working in those teams. All right. So any other thoughts specifically, sort of on the general idea of sole teaching versus some type of team teaching? Yeah.
So you guys seem to have a fair amount of experience with this topic in general. How many times do you find that you're working with the same teams from year to year? Because I think continuity familiarity with the material from year to year as a beginning instructor is also important.
And that, in fact, starts bringing efficiency into it if you can maintain the same team over several years. So in my experience, so Chris and I have taught together. This will be our fourth time of teaching this class together. Initially, she had a smaller subset of the classes, and over time, she's now teaches half of the classes. Terry and I had sort of taught together or worked together where we had different sections, and then when we were assigned together as co-instructors in the same section, we kind of knew a lot about what the other one was going to do because we'd already kind of shared across sections.
But we will likely won't do that again.
But that was probably a one-off.
Just logistically.
Logistically, it happened once, and in the foreseeable future, it probably won't happen again. So I'm team teaching with someone who I've never team taught before in another section of the intro bio class this fall, and in the spring I'll team teach with a third person that I've never team taught with before, and she, again, and in the future I'm not sure how those assignments will go. So I have had experience both with kind of the long term as well as more short term. In terms of the rotational teaching that I did earlier in my career, there were teams that were doing the same thing for 5 years, and in that situation, you're in this rut. You just don't change anything. You know what the other instructors did before. It's really efficient. You kind of spend 10 minutes before 2 weeks before the semester and go, are we going to change anything? No, we're not going to change anything. Okay, let's go. And so it's very efficient, right? That's what I'll say about it.
Can I answer that real quick?
If I could just add to that, if you're thinking about negotiating this with your chairs and things like that, one of the models that BMB has been using is that pairing a fixed-term person whose primary responsibilities are associated with teaching, who have a lot of experience in understanding pedagogy and things like that, with an incoming pre-tenure person. And that is, there's a real nice argument to be made for efficiency there, and also helping the person learn how to teach. A lot of us in science don't teach very much as a postdoc or as a graduate student, maybe some TAing and labs and things like this. But this provides a nice professional development opportunity, and it's really, it's something that you can really sell, I think to chairs, and thinking about tenure and promotion and those sorts of things.
Along that same lines, what I wanted to add to that too is that it depends on what your role in the course is. So both John and Terry are coordinators of the course, whereas I don't have those kinds of administrative roles. So my take on how the team functions and how much continuity there is between years and sections might be totally different from them. In one case, I'm a rotational, I do 1 out of 13 there's 13 different instructors. I don't even know some of the instructors who teach the same class. Because I'm also not the one coordinating it, I'm just told you show up this day and do it. So I think there is a bit of a different opinion depending on if you're in doing an instructional part or if you're also coordinating.
Have you had any experience where the lead sort of cornerstone person moves on, and does that course keep on living? Succession planning? It's a good question.
Personal experience, no, but we're planning for that. Yeah.
So in terms of rotational teaching, I have, because I was a coordinator for these upper level courses and I taught them rotationally. I was sort of the person who kept the institutional memory of this course for 7 or 8 years, and then I moved on, and so the department found someone else to sort of take on that role, and we worked together so that he at least knew what had been happening, and then he started bringing his own ideas in and changing things as he saw fit. But yeah, I think that if there's a complete break there, you really lose some institutional memory. It's really too bad if you can't plan more. I mean, things happen, right? People get new jobs and move away suddenly. But ideally, you would try to plan for these things so you don't lose that. So another thing I want to go back to with before we move on here has to do with this idea of pairing someone who has deep teaching experience and pedagogical knowledge with someone who is maybe a new faculty member and is learning. And so Chris and I had this experience, and the first year we did some things in hindsight that probably exacerbated this problem. it's rough being a new teacher and trying to follow somebody who has a huge amount of teaching experience and has done things and evolved their teaching over 10 years. Right? You're going, wait, I got to stand up in front of 250 students and do what for how? And I'm like, yeah, I've been doing this for so long, and as my teaching has evolved, I have lots of things that I do that when I first started, I couldn't have possibly done all these things that I do, right? But I've done them often enough now that I can integrate them and coordinate them, and I can deal with it when I'm up there in front of the students. And so it can be kind of rough for that other person to step into this situation, because the students are comparing, right? They know, and they're comparing. And so I think when you have that kind of situation, you need to be very conscious of that and work to mitigate it. And so for example, this year I'm teaching, same type of scenario, a new faculty member, team teaching with them, their research intensive faculty. We didn't wait as long in the class to have that faculty come in. They started teaching much sooner in the class, not the first lecture, but probably the 5th lecture, they actually stepped in and started teaching. And then we also sprinkled some of the things later on in the class. We kind of went back and forth a little bit. And I think that really did kind of help to mitigate that difference between experience levels.
There are other tricks too, if I can add. For those who are maybe look a little younger, when I first started, I had students asking me if I was a graduate student. And also as a female, they do make comments sometimes on what you're wearing and everything. So the first day in class, I wore a big fancy suit, and I make it a big to-do that I don't even normally dress like this. I usually wear jeans, but don't do that. Walk in like you know what you're doing. That helps a lot. And for those of you who are also new, it was a great opportunity to learn from John, but like he said, I'm trying to balance clickers and all these things, and I tried to take his slides because I thought this is how the course should be taught. And it did not work. I teach the same content the next year, but I've really changed the slides completely. I've made them my own, and the students reacted much better to it. So just because someone gives you a syllabus and materials, use your own voice. Like, try to make it how you think you're going to do it the best. You don't have to do what somebody did the year before just because they handed it to you.
And so that was another thing that I worked with Michaela, who I'm co-teaching with now. I said to her, here's my slides. I don't want to hold out on you, but you have to take these and make these your own. If you just stand up with these and try to lecture, it's not going to go well. Well, she kind of listened to me. The first time she made a few changes, and afterwards she's like, yeah, that didn't work. So she went back, and the next lecture she learned, she went through and she made the slides her own. I kind of had to keep telling her, there's nothing sacred about these slides. You do what you need to do. You gotta make them your own. So that's another thing. You want to support the new faculty and give them resources, but they have to make it their own. You can't. It's really hard. I've taught for a long time, and I can't stand up with somebody else's slides and do a really good job. I have to take them and play with them and make them my own if I'm really going to do a good job.
Kind of speaking along those lines, when you're multiple teaching, you guys probably have different strategies for how much is active, how much is backward design, that kind of stuff. How do you try to work that out in a sort of an even fashion? Some people just get up there and automatically stand and deliver, and they can kind of go forever. And then other people are much better at breaking it up and letting the students have some time to do stuff. You're laughing. You know this problem.
I am class 5 minutes early. John is class maybe 5 minutes late. Like the timing and how we break things up, we're still struggling with it and trying to come up with it. As a new instructor, John says, so what are your learning objectives? I'm like, what the hell is a learning objective? So doing like the STEM fellowship helped a lot. And then initially I just used what he had, and then I've been changing it as I've been getting more comfortable with coming up with things like learning objectives. So.
Because you do feel sort of guilty as a new instructor, especially when you stand
I'm
up
not
there and you're
doing
not
enough.
lecturing the whole time.
Like I'm not doing enough. I still feel that even though I'm doing it. It's always like, what should I be doing? It's really hard.
And I think that it is a negotiation process. So depending who I'm teaching with, I do tend to change my teaching style a little bit to try to make the shock between the two. And given complete freedom in the class as sole instructor, I would have an extremely active classroom, right? But if I know I'm going to be co-teaching with someone who doesn't have quite that same philosophy, I try to push them towards me a little bit, but I'm willing to move towards them a little bit too, to try to make sure that it's not a huge shock between the two instructors.
And that's what happened when the two of us taught together. But I still think that I probably ended up talking more than you did
But that's not necessarily bad. It wasn't,
Right.
it wasn't extreme.
Well, and the students knew to expect that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they do get comfortable with that
Yeah.
after a while,
Mhm.
yeah.
And I would say too that it goes the other way. John also sometimes adopts things other people do. So it's not just him trying to get people to go his way. He's changed some of the things that he does. Like with the tablets, we do a lot more note taking now and things than before. So that's been back and forth. It helps to have somebody who has a group of people who have very similar teaching philosophies overall. Whether or not we all came in with the same initial idea, but similar end goals.
Okay, do we want to kind of move on and do some specific comparisons here? Okay, so who's going to do this slide? I lost track of it.
I'm gonna write.
Okay, you're
So
going
if
to
you want to, you guys can rock, paper, scissors.
Okay, so what we'd like for you to do now is, for those of you who did collaborative teaching and rotational teaching, so up here in the front, give us some of your ideas, having tried to compare a class you designed as a sole instructor to rotational or collaborative. What are some of the pros and cons, do you think, of rotational versus collaborative? I know you're not directly comparing what you did, but I think you have a feel here. So what are some of the things you think that where collaborative teaching might have an advantage over rotational teaching?
So remember, collaborative is when both instructors are at every class meeting and interacting with the students versus rotational where one person is delivering the lecture and the other person is probably not there.
I think you have a better sense for the class and how they're progressing or where problems are coming up if you're kind of both there and engaged all the time, because you're just seeing when there's like shock on the students' faces and you need to go back and assess something, etc. So just stay more in tune.
So that's a pro.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the students are more comfortable knowing who's going to be talking to them at any given point instead of completely changing the course halfway through.
Yeah.
Corey, so it says an improved student to instructor ratio. So there's more bodies in the room, right?
More work and time spent by the instructors.
So you're putting that in the con
In
side.
the con
Yes.
side, yes.
Yeah, there we go.
I caught the.
So sometimes when you're at the front of the class teaching, you don't quite know how well it's being received or how confused or how engaged the students are. Where if you have another person who is equally responsible for the course, who can see how things are being received by the class, it's like, it's a sounding board.
And as a new instructor, that is so helpful. John would come up and say, "Hey, they might want to hear about this," and
If the collaboration has only gone kind of halfway and there's not as much coordination, then the two instructors might actually contest each other on certain topics. The students don't know what to know.
so if it's a con, if not done well, it's not
If
good.
not done well, the students might get confused about what's the right answer.
You have multiple experts in the room, so if there's something that maybe you're not comfortable with presenting, but like that's your lecture, you have the other professor there that you can say, well, hey, I think this, but like, what do you think?
So diverse backgrounds.
If there's more than one person responsible for the entire course, do students pit the instructors against each other? Not necessarily on the
Good call,
topics,
bad
but oh, well, I submitted this late and Professor A said it's not okay, so I'm gonna ask Professor B and they're gonna say it is okay.
Yes.
That happens?
Yes.
In my experience, the students will email both of us. They'll CC both of us on an email.
So you have to
But
make every decision together.
Well, and so one thing I'm not still very good at is checking and making sure the students, or seeing if the students copied both of us, because sometimes I'll just respond back to the student, not reply all, and then Kristen's kind of out of the loop, and that's not very good. But I think in terms of planning, in all of these cases, if you plan very carefully and make it very clear from the beginning that this is the person you go to for these types of things, and then if I get the stuff that they're supposed to talk to Terry about, I just forward her the email. And if she gets stuff they're supposed to talk to me about, forward the email to me. And if it's any kind of major decision at all, you have to talk to the other person and make sure that you're thinking along the same lines. So yeah, I think it's very, very important, first of all, to try to set up expectations of who's going to be doing what, and then communicate very well, because like Terry said, the students, they're not stupid. If they see that they can pit, instructor A against instructor B to their advantage, that they will do that.
So can I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Yeah.
So I sort of see that there might be a benefit to sort of even hybrid these two things. Like the peer rotational where someone's just coming in and they might not ever even meet in the same room and talk to each other. There's not like a strong course coordinator. But there is a way to do rotational teaching a little bit more collaboratively, right? If you
Absolutely.
have, I mean, have you guys seen good models for that where maybe there is a course coordinator that stays there the whole time as people are coming through to kind of make it a little bit more cohesive and maybe has at least one meeting a semester where folks are talking to each
And
other?
that's really how the rotational teaching I did initially, that's how it worked. After the first time I'd done it, I was the course coordinator, and I actually did go to all the lectures. I mean, and then when I had to take over for somebody, it was pretty easy because I'd sat through it often enough, I knew how to do the lecture. But at some point, it gets really boring to sit there through those. And what I would start doing, I was watching the students to see what the students were doing, to the point where actually students complained on the Sears that I shouldn't stare at them while they were. So yeah, I think all these are not, silos. I think you can move across and take advantage of these different things. So I think there are ways where perhaps if the instructors are rotating, but they're showing up maybe once every 2 weeks to kind of key lectures that might be things that are going to tie into what they're doing, that you could get a lot of the advantages without having to be there every time. You wouldn't get the advantage, I don't think, of creating the connections with the students that you do when the instructor is there every time.
I was just kind of thinking in terms of like baby steps, like
Yes, I think.
Of like, if you're approaching a course that's purely rotational and that seems like a big leap. to
Yes,
the whole
so
way, like-
absolutely. Try to get them to, attend a few lectures and see how things go, and especially if you could get them to attend a few lectures where there's activity, where they interact with the students, that may actually help convince them that there's value in having them there all the time.
I would say that another maybe thing to focus on for that kind of baby steps would be the exams, right? Because the exams are the place where you get a lot of negative comments that Professor A's exam was much easier than Professor B's or something like that. So even if they're not going to lectures, that could be an opportunity to provide more cohesiveness.
A good rule of thumb too is for an established course not to change too many things at a time. We had a semester where we changed the curriculum, we changed the textbook, and we threw in these modeling activities and team teaching across sections. It was the hardest semester of my life. So if you're planning to make these changes, try to integrate it across time. Like give yourself a break, you can't do everything at once. So
One
try
big
to,
thing a semester.
yeah.
Unless, of course, you can get some kind of relief time to completely redesign things and maybe start, restart. But if you're just kind of have the normal assignments and you're moving forward, trying to redesign things all at once, it's probably better to do an evolution type of thing where you start moving in this direction. And really, that's how my teaching evolved. I didn't suddenly walk into the classroom one day and say, I'm going to go from straight lecturing with 4 multiple choice exams to this really engaged team teaching thing with the students in groups. It didn't happen that way, right? It evolved over time in little kind of baby steps.
So speaking of time, should we maybe
Move on? I don't know, we're having a good conversation.
Okay.
It's just like along that sense of like baby steps, is there, preferable, do you want to start with objectives, like creating more structure and then moving into maybe more group activities and then changing the exams, or changing exams first, and because I feel like some of these could, it'll jostle the students differently depending on the order in which they're introduced.
I mean, in my opinion, I always advise people to start with objectives. True backward design, you start with what you want to assess and then go back and design your objectives. But I think especially when you're team teaching, agreeing on common objectives helps you align other things as well. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to coordinate between instructors.
Part of it will depend on your course structure too and how much resources you have. When we first did free response questions, it was John and I grading 300 of them by ourselves without any help. And then, so we had one very short question because there's no way to do it. But then as we got more TAs and more ULAs, now it's, 40% of our exam is free response? And so we built on that as we got more resources.
And I guess the other thing I would say is you kind of made this this or that or the other thing. I think really these things need to be aligned. So you might tweak a little bit of each of those. You might change an objective to make it a little higher order, involve a science practice or some kind of activity. And then because of that, you tweak a little bit of what you did in class and you tweak a little bit in the exam, but you don't radically change all of those things all at once. So that would be kind of my thought on that.
But if you're starting at ground zero, make sure you have objectives.
Yes, always start with the
MSU students are
objective.
starting to expect them from everybody.
So my concern is, if you take two people who have quite a bit of teaching experience and kind of set in their ways, how do you make them to team teach and have to adjust so their objectives will come to a common ground? It seems to be that, and do the people respect, the instructors respect each other and they respect their
Yeah. And so the truth is, I have never been in that exact situation. So it's going to happen this spring. So in a year, or after the spring, ask me. When I've team taught, Terry and I, we both were very experienced, but we had, I think, pretty similar teaching philosophies and teaching styles. I think maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, I think you're correct.
Yeah.
And so, for example, we had sections of the course that were dispersed, probably 3 to 5 lectures, and then we would take turns. And so the person for that section would say, okay, here are my objectives. What do you think? Is there anything missing? Is there anything extraneous? And we set up a really good method of communication early on that we stuck with through the semester.
And even though we're all very similar, though, we've disagreed on things. I mean, there are definitely one module of the course that we were both I was completely polarized, but, I mean, it's fine. It's the way it went, and it's not a big deal. We just talked our way through it and moved on.
But I think in your situation, where you have two really established instructors who've taught the same course for a number of years, and there really are some fundamental differences in kind of core teaching philosophy. I don't know. I think that's a really difficult situation to try to integrate those two. I don't know that I have any great advice or great insight into how that's going to happen. I think both people have to be willing to give something, essentially. Willing to give up or try something new.
I can give you the name of a book on collaborative teaching that talks a lot about communication if you are interested in it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you find it a benefit to have some sort of unifying resource like a textbook for these sort of approaches, or is it an impediment, or do the students just not care either way?
So I think that in these situations, anything you do that provides common threads throughout the course is important. So the textbook, we've always, in this situation, in fact, all the team teaching situations I've done, there was a textbook that we all used throughout the course, even in the rotational teaching.
Pretty similar chunks of assessments too. Like 80% might be exams, do what you want with the other 20, but at least 80% would be the same thing. That was fun, having 20 instructors all choose the same textbook, of course. That's talk about capital time, but, we did it.
And now they want to change.
How much time goes into getting everyone on the same page? Do you meet weekly? Are these meetings an hour?
So let's put a pin on that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. No, but it's a great question, but we'll move forward and talk about that in a minute. So let's go ahead and move forward.
Can I just add one more thing though? You guys all we came up with these ahead of time in case people were shy and didn't want to shout things out. The only thing that we didn't talk about right now was professional development for the GTAs and ULAs too. We're thinking about ourselves as instructors right now, but as you're coordinating big teams, you're providing a really valuable skill to young scientists who are learning how to become instructors so that they don't get in front of a classroom for the first time and go, oh, what the hell do I do? So I think that that's really important to have these meetings.
Well, and even with just the team teaching with 2 instructors, I've taught for a long time, and every time I teach with somebody new, I'm like, oh, wow, why didn't I ever think of that? That's a great, it keeps me evolving, keeps me trying new things.
And the TA is the constant throughout the semester. Even if the instructors change, the students have that constant TA.
And then the last point, I don't think we articulated either, modeling professional interactions between the instructors for the students, I think is really important.
So if you're collaborating and you're both there in the classroom, the students get to see how you interact, and if and sometimes it may be easier if there's somebody else in the classroom who's a professional. It may be harder, I don't know, to say, I don't know the answer to that question. What do you think? know? And the students can see that, we don't know everything all the time, and sometimes we have a little dialogue. Well, I don't know either, but, here's the upper bound, it couldn't be more than this, and there's, kind of have those interactions, and the students actually get to see how scientists think about these things, they don't really know the answer. So that is another advantage we didn't talk about.
And just point out as like from the TA's perspective, I've done a course where it was, well, you're just grading this, that's your job, attend, whatever. And then I've done the course with Kristen and John. And from my perspective as a TA, they give us the exams beforehand, so they want feedback from us. We get their clicker questions beforehand. So it's great for someone like me who wants to go into teaching, because I kind of see what's going on in their heads. And the same thing for some of the undergrad learning assistants that we had as well.
As part of the grad training program and the postdoc training program, Natalia also developed her own learning objectives and gave her own lecture too. So you did a lot more than.
Yeah, but it's still a lot more than like other TA-ships where you basically just show up to class and then you just grade a lot of the times. So you get to see how you guys go through the learning objectives. How do you come up with learning objectives? How do you write exams? So it's definitely a step above a normal TA-ship that one would have.
So maybe for the interest of time, we'll skip the writing part and just. Okay.
And I think we've talked a lot about
Yep.
some of these issues kind of all bled together. So back to your issue. So the cons of having a true teaching team where you have GTAs and ULAs, when you put time versus rotational teaching or sole teaching versus collaborative teaching versus team teaching, there is a huge time sink here. Okay, and if you get GTAs and ULAs and you expect them to be interactive in the classroom as part of the team, and you just say, okay, tomorrow we're going to talk about glycolysis, you guys show up and be ready. It's going to be a disaster because, first of all, they think they know more than they do in many cases, right? And then when the students start asking them questions, they don't know how to respond. And then in some cases, they will patently say things that are completely wrong, which is the last thing you want to have happen, right? So you need to prepare them both in content and in what they need to do with the interactions. Because you tell them, okay, go talk to the students, they're kind of going, okay, nobody has their hands up, I'm not going to go talk to the students. So it's really important, and so if you're doing active learning, that the GTAs and ULAs know what the active learning is, know talking points, know kind of things that you as an instructor know the students are going to struggle with, so they're prepared to answer those questions. And know that when they run into something that they don't know, they have to say, I don't know, right? And they can get help from other members of the instructional team to figure it out. So a huge amount of time has to go into this. So in terms of 161, I serve two roles. I'm an instructor in the course. I'm also the curriculum coordinator over all the sections. And so each week I have a meeting with all the GTAs and ULAs for all of the sections where we talk about pedagogy and how you interact with student groups and how you ask questions and how you guide the students through thinking. And in some cases, I also had content in there that was common across the sections. So that's an hour of my time every week for this meeting. Plus, I have to think about and prep for that meeting every week. In addition to that, we have a section-specific meeting with our GTAs and ULAs to say, this next week, these are the things we're doing. So there's another hour out of my time. And there's not too much prep for that because it's basically the same prep I would do for lecture, right? But so there's at least probably 2.5 to 3 hours out of my week that I'm spending with these instructional teams to make sure that they are prepared.
But
So,
you don't have to do that for the lectures you're not teaching.
that's true. So I'm still doing the general training all semester, but because we're a team, when Kristen's teaching, I don't have to worry about the meeting. I just have to be there. I mean, so it's still, I don't have to prepare for it, but I'm there as part of the instructional team. So there really is a lot of time that goes into developing true team teaching.
And you might need to change your workflow too. So for example, for me, if I've already taught a class before, I will constrain the amount of time that I need to spend on each lecture because that will expand to fit whatever time I have. So I constrain it. And normally how I do that is I leave it till right before the lecture. Well, I can't do that if I have a team, right? I need to have my lecture done, have all the clicker questions fleshed out, and get that to my TAs the day before so that they have time to prepare.
And absolutely. And then another thing that goes along with that is file management, right? So if you're editing your slides and playing with your slides up to 10 minutes before the lecture, and you change things, the GTAs and ULAs aren't going to know you changed things. And sometimes that can have bad effects if you change something that they thought they understood, and they go into class and they think they know what the question is, but you changed the question, and now they're telling the students something wrong. I mean, it would have been right for the question, but you changed something, and now they're, so you have to really make sure you spend time with far enough in advance that everyone on the team knows what's going on. And file management, I confess, I'm teaching 2 sections of the course with Kristen, and I went in, I was working on my slides, and I was like, I know Kristen had this really cool slide, so I go into her slides to get this slide, it's all in Dropbox, and somehow I mess up her slides like 2 hours before lecture and didn't realize it. So now she's in lecture going, I know I had a slide. So, yeah. So you got to be really careful with file management when you have lots of people working on these files.
Anything anyone wants to add before we go to the?
I think we've hit all of the things up there. Is there anything else that you thought of?
So if you were trying to convince like someone who's been doing like very strict rotational teaching for 10 years and has their lectures packed, if you wanted to try to convince them that doing some form of collaborative teaching or team teaching was the way to go, what would you say?
So why don't we go forward 2 slides? Let's skip this next slide. Oh, there we go. Yep. So our perspective would be, you have to think about student outcomes, right? I think there's a lot of evidence in the research literature that just lecturing to the students and giving them multiple choice exams does not result in quality retention or quality understanding of the topics. There's also a lot of evidence in the literature that people who really understand the pedagogy and take the time to design these collaborative learning experiences where there's teams of people interacting with the students in class can result in much higher so better learning. I would actually say that, better learning. The students score better on exams, they score better on standardized concept inventories. There's some evidence that they retain these things longer, although that's, I would say, a weaker set of evidence. So if you're worried about quality outcomes, I would say that that has to be the argument. It can't be an argument in terms of efficiency and time, because I do not believe it's more efficient to teach this way in terms of the amount of time it takes.
Also, with that, it depends really your role, because as someone who's not coordinating the class, I think it's actually, the time is pretty 50-50, because I'm not developing everything de novo, and I don't have to deal with the levels of coordination that John does. So for me, I spend a more concentrated amount of time on a shorter number of lectures to make them as good as I can, instead of that same amount of time spread between 16 lectures.
But also, Erica, I think you need to sell it as professional development, because no matter what level you're at, you can always learn something by working with someone else.
Yeah.
Is the quality of teaching ever assessed externally?
So in our situation, no. And that, I think that's a shortcoming. I would love to be able to do that, but it's difficult and resource intensive to do that type of thing. So basically, we are hoping that based on adopting things from the literature that have been shown to work in other situations, that in fact we are producing, or that the students are getting a better quality experience and their learning has increased. As an instructor, I know that when I'm in this last situation here, in the class, interacting with the groups, I know what the students are struggling with, and I can be helping those students on a small scale get past things that they would never have gotten past if I was standing up there and lecturing. And I shouldn't say never, but I think fewer students would get past. And because there's other members in the instructional team who are well-trained, they are also helping those students at the students' level where the barriers are, getting past that. And so while I don't have any concrete assessment of what we've been doing, I think we're implementing the things from the literature that would indicate that the students are coming out with these. I would love to be able to assess that. I haven't come up with a way that I could do it with the time and resources that I currently have. So.
Let's do this last slide, and then we can stick around for questions. These are perspectives, pros and cons from students, both from the literature and from us. With multiple people in the classroom, students find it easier to talk to an instructor just because there's more bodies there. We've already talked about that. And people bring multiple perspectives to the room. And also, we already talked about modeling of professional interactions. Cons, these actually come straight from the literature. Many students will complain about disorganization, no matter how organized you are. So it's really important to be, to set up a good method of communication very early on and stick to that throughout the semester. Even though you get into the swing of things, it's, you know, sometimes in the middle of the semester you start easing back on talking to each other. You have to keep that up, and I think it's better for the course overall. One thing that John and I did was we, in the syllabus, put the initials of who would be leading each day, and I think that students really appreciated that, knowing who was going to be up at the front when they came in. Additionally, something else you can clear up in the syllabus is who to talk to about what, or you can put it in a widget right on front of your D2L. If you have questions about clickers, and you have the email link right there. And then, as John said, if we got a question personally that wasn't in our purview, we just forwarded it to the other person to make sure that we were dealing with the students fairly. And then something else you can actually talk about at the beginning of the course is assessment, and how the team will be working on assessments together, and that will help alleviate this anxiety that has been mentioned in multiple literature reviews about team teaching that students have over being assessed by two different people. That the assessments themselves will be different, or that the instructors will use different rubrics and grade in a different way.
Qualitatively, to answer your question a little more, in our SEARS forms where we've had the modeling activities where the students break into groups and we have that high ratio of instructor to students, that was the thing that qualitatively they commented most favorably on, that they liked the most in the class, with these little breakout groups. So there's no formal assessment on it, but they like that.
Do you feel that you have to sell this team teaching to the students when you start the course, like the first lecture? Do you have an introduction about it? Do you tell them this is for your benefit for such and such reason, or do you just plain tell them this is how it's going to work?
I think the latter. Just this is how it's going to be.
But it was very clear from the very first, I think it's very important from the very first, that you present yourself as an instructional team and don't make a big deal about it. This is just how it is.
Yeah.
That was our approach. So.
All right, so in the interest of time, please join me in thanking the folks for a wonderful